Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of the We Got It podcast, which is an official podcast of Spartans Illustrated. We are truly so thankful to be connected to such an awesome community of Spartan fans through our little podcast, and also through Spartans Illustrated in general. It's been such a wonderful just community to be a part of. And Jonah, you kind of got a special opportunity to travel down to the armpit of America to cover the Ohio State Michigan State basketball matchup for Spartans Illustrated, which was really a kind of a unique experience.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun traveling down to Columbus to be able to cover the game, be able to sit in on the press conference after the game, talk to some of the players. But yeah, excited to get into that this episode. As always, as we get started, we appreciate your support. We appreciate your continued support as well. If you guys can hit the follow button, hit the subscribe button, give us likes on these episodes when you see them, helps us grow and reach more Spartan fans to make sure that they got it covered as well. And yeah, we're excited to dive into this game.
Definitely. Also, we want to hear from you. Our email is the wegotitpodcast@gmail.com. And today we're covering on our We Got It Covered segment, really taking a peek at the 4 new teams that are joining the Big Ten this year. The broadcasters were joking about how it's really the Big 18 now, but we're going to stick with the Big 10 as the name for now. But we want to hear what you guys have questions about. What do you want to know more about basketball, about hockey? We could go down our own little learning journey with you on that. So if you have any ideas of what you want to know more about, please let us know either on our socials or feel free to email us at thewegotitpodcast@gmail.com. Welcome to the We Got It podcast,
a Michigan State sports podcast for everyone.
We're Jonah and Abby, a husband and wife who's probably a little too obsessed with Spartan sports.
And we want to share a little bit of that obsession with you, from casual fans
to die-hard bleed green fanatics.
And we want to make following Spartan sports easy, enjoyable, and engaging for everyone.
Go green! So, Jonah, I made kind of a bold prediction at the end of last week's episode that if we went to Ohio and came away with a win, that I thought that that was going to significantly affect the trajectory of the rest of January. And I said, conversely, if we are not able to pull away a win against Ohio State, I thought that that was going to be a hard hole for our guys to climb out of. Now, we did walk away with a victory in Ohio, which always just feels so good. Do you think that that prediction is going to hold true going into the game against Washington? Where are you feeling like the guys are at after this game?
I think the guys are feeling really good and confident after that win versus Ohio State. It's always impressive to be able to go on the road in the Big Ten and pull off a victory, especially in a game where outside of an 8 or 9 minute stretch really controlled throughout the game. And yeah, you could hear the guys celebrating in the locker room after the game. And this was a big one for them. They were really happy to get it. And I think gave them a lot of confidence going into the rest of this slate in January, because they have an opportunity to continue to build on this lead that they have in the Big Ten, along with Michigan, who's also undefeated in the Big Ten. But they have an opportunity, like you said, to kind of go on a little bit of a roll and to really get a good start here in Big Ten play.
And I think 2 things there. One, it felt like that was almost the start of Big Ten play. Yes, we had beaten Minnesota. Yes, we had beaten Nebraska. We had one of those wins on the road. But it really felt like this is where the grittiness of Big Ten play starts. And so being able to go out after Christmas break, after a pretty sloppy win against Western Michigan, to have such a, I mean, like you said, truly dominant performance for 3/4 of that game plus. And then to not only have that, but now go into the rest of Big Ten play 3-0, and you've got a home game. And so I just think that's what I meant when I said, I think that if we are in the hole after that Ohio State game, it's just not as satisfying going into that Washington game. And so I'm hopeful. I think this is going to be a strong January. I think there's a lot of rhetoric in past years that Izzo starts playing his best ball in February, trying to get these boys ready for March. But I'm going to argue that I think it's going to happen in January this year.
Yeah, and the schedule really opens up for them in January to have a more favorable run where it gets more difficult in February. So I don't think you want to necessarily have to wait for Michigan State to play its best ball in February. You really want them to be able to stack some of these wins in January. That way they can maybe afford to lose a couple in February and still be in a good place to compete for a Big Ten title.
Definitely. So let's dig in a little bit more to that game against Ohio State, that performance overall. Let's start with some of the negatives. What were things that we saw from the Spartans that we were hoping not to see that still showed its face in Columbus this week?
I think especially in that stretch where Michigan State went from up 14 to down 1. You really saw the turnovers and rebounding really take a big negative turn and really allowed Ohio State to get back into this game rather quickly without Michigan State putting up much resistance.
Absolutely. It almost seemed just like Ohio State had their way with whatever they wanted to. At one point, there were 4 Spartans underneath the basket for a defensive rebound and 1 Ohio State player. And I swear not a single one of those guys made an effort to get after that ball. And that was, those middle 10 minutes of the second half. And I was fuming at my TV. And so I think, it just really felt like, where did we go? I mean, we had been playing, aside from turnovers in the first half, really well. Our defense had them locked down. And so to see that really fall apart, especially after a timeout, like I thought we would kind of clean things up, and it just continued that way for a while. Thankfully, though, the boys turned that around and didn't turn the ball over for the last 8 minutes of the game, which I think that, along with our free throw shooting, is truly the reason why we won that game. I mean, just being able to maintain possession, maintain control, set the pace of the game for those last 8 minutes helped shut Ohio State out and led to the Spartans being able to pull out that win.
Absolutely, because it wasn't a perfect night by any means. I mean, Michigan State still didn't shoot well from behind the arc. They had that pretty bad stretch of 8 or 9 minutes where they were just kind of handing Ohio State the ball, couldn't rebound, and then they still pulled out a 7-point victory on the road. And I think that shows just kind of the potential of this team where they can get these wins on the road even when they don't get their best performance for 40 minutes.
Absolutely. So now let's talk about, I feel like when I think about that game, there were several big moments and several key aspects of our play that I think are the reason we pulled away with that win. One, we just talked about limiting turnovers to 0 in the last 8 minutes. And then also our free throw shooting. I mean, we were 18 for 22 from the line. The Buckeyes only shot 16 free throws and made 11 of those. And so that right there is a 7-point difference. And we ended up winning the game 69-62. So those free throws are the scoring difference in that game. So not only our ability to get to the line, but actually sinking those free throws. And I got to shout out Cohen Carr.
Yeah.
I mean, that kid had been, I think, like 70-ish% from the line prior to, I think, like the last 5 or 6 games. Might have even been less than that, 60s. And he went off, and I think he made, 18 free throws? 21 consecutive free throws, and he finally had his first miss in the Ohio State game, but still went 7 for 8 from the line. Yeah. And that's just huge for us. I also think one of the things that was massive was just coming out strong and with a lead. I think that's something that I was really worried heading into the road game of Big Ten play. You know, at home, we have started so many games, even against little teams like Niagara or against Western Michigan, of being down for the first 5 to 10 minutes of the game. And it's so much easier to dig yourself out of that hole when you have a home crowd, but you're not getting out of any holes on the road. And so I think seeing them come out with a strong start was massive. And I hope to see that continue in future games.
Right. And they had a pretty clear game plan to start both halves really, and they had an emphasis to get the ball into the paint to both Jackson Kohler and Zapala, and those guys were able to execute wonderfully to be able to start both those halves really well, and especially in that first half, getting off to that quick lead really didn't allow the Ohio State crowd to really get into it much in that first half. And honestly, some of the loudest cheers in the first half were from the Michigan State fans and their "Go Green, Go White" chants.
Good.
Obviously, they came alive a little bit in the second half when Ohio State went on that run, but starting on the road in that way, making sure the crowd doesn't get into it early, doesn't make sure that Ohio State doesn't get momentum. It's really big, and it's set up then to be able to kind of hold on to that lead for the first half.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some key plays, because there were some moments in that game that have just been living rent-free in my mind ever since. And I think the first one that I have to highlight was that veteran, nasty little juke out from Jaden Akins as time expired on the shot clock for a nice little fadeaway 3, and he just drained it. And it was like, that was a Tyson Walker move. That was just a senior elite move where you got a defender on you so tight and you still just find a way to get the bucket when your team really needs it.
And that was kind of when Ohio State was kind of going on a little bit of a mini run in the first half. And Jaden Akins was able to knock down that shot, which led to Michigan State being able to hold on to a lead going into halftime, which was huge.
Definitely. I think another massive play was, I think it came in the second half when Booker was in the game. And maybe I need to pause here and talk about the absolute lockdown defense that we had, which forced Bruce Thornton to dribble the ball off of his foot, which is then scooped up by Booker. And he, just pounded down the court. You could see he kind of did like a little look over both shoulders and then just went for it. And he drove down the floor, laid up for a nice little layup, got that and one. And that was a huge moment for us.
Right, because that was right after Ohio State had just taken the lead in the second half. And that's really where Michigan State had their answer for that big Ohio State run, and they didn't give up control of the game after that moment.
No, and I think too, along with that, and I'm probably getting these plays out of order, but the incredible 3-point shot from Trey Holloman. But I think even more incredible than that was the setup, though. So Trey has the ball at the top of the key, passes it off to Jeremy Fears, who drives towards the hoop, pulling both defenders with him. And then he just has this like Cassius-like ability to see the floor. And he is so convincing all the way to the hoop. And then he just like flips it back to Trey Holloman, who is miles wide open, who drains the 3. And I think those were just some of the biggest moments that really silenced Ohio State and put Michigan State back on top in that game.
Absolutely. I think we can't really go any further in the discussion of this game without mentioning Szymon Zapala and his performance throughout the night, especially that stretch with like 2 minutes left to go in the first half and the first several minutes of the first half. Or second half where it seemed like he was scoring on every single possession.
Oh, absolutely.
And made this, I think it was like a 4 or 5 point lead late in this first half to a 14-point lead early in the second half.
Massive going into halftime on the road. And I thought I saw just like a little bit of nastiness coming out from him, which I mean in the best way. Like just seeing him on the court, how he interacts with the guys, like he just seems like such a sweet person, like just a genuinely good guy. And I think that's wonderful, but I also want to see a little bit of that anger come out on the court. And you saw, if you watch the replay, Michigan State basketball social media did an incredible highlight video from the game. So if you really want to get pumped up again about that win, you should definitely go check it out. I was losing my mind watching it this morning, but they showed an excellent view from kind of like behind the hoop of Zapala when he had that dunk. He just has his defender super tight on him, and you can see the moment where he just gets like gnarly and he just decides to drive to the hoop and slam it down. And it was like there was no stopping him. His defender was left in the dust. And so I just love seeing that grit come out from him. And I'm going to volunteer that he was my player of the week. He just was so dominant. And I think those points in the paint, because we were shooting so poorly from behind the arc, was again, another difference maker in that Ohio State game. So for me, Szymon Zapala is my player of the week.
Absolutely. And the fact that this is now Michigan State's 8th different leading scorer in a game.
Wild.
And you're going to need that on the road. You're going to need different players to step up, take advantage of mismatches, to be aggressive, be assertive, to have that confidence, because every night's not going to be Jaden Akins or Trey Holloman or Jace Richardson's night. Sometime you're going to have other guys step up and be that guy. And that was Zapala for the Spartans, and was probably the catalyst for one of the most significant segments of the game, kind of to end the first half and begin the second. Yeah, Zapala has been a great addition for the Spartans. I know a lot of people kind of doubted this pickup going into the year. Wasn't a flashy pickup. Didn't have a ton of production at Utah State and Longwood, but he's been just absolutely solid, consistent, has been impactful on both sides of the ball for Michigan State. When asked about it after the game, about just that consistent impact that Zapala has had, Izzo even said that he didn't anticipate this much consistent impact.
And I thought he was really going to almost struggle heading into more intense Big Ten play. Like, I think I've been really impressed with him. I've been impressed with his consistency. You know, he's been putting up like 5 to 6 points a game, pulling down a consistent amount of boards. He's getting some good blocks. He's an excellent defender. But I thought that those stats were going to kind of taper as we headed into tough Big Ten play. And I was not expecting him to just explode like he did against Ohio State. I also want to highlight a defensive player of the week, because I think Jeremy Fears Jr. had a pretty quiet game from a scoring standpoint. But the way that and it was, Tom talked about this, it was a committee effort, but I think really, Jeremy was the one leading that committee of just shutting down Bruce Thornton. So for those of you who don't know, Bruce Thornton had averaged over 30 points a game on his last 2 games. He is the leading scorer in the Big Ten. I think he averages about 17.5 points per game. 30 of those points in those last 2 games, I heard that stat and I was like, these are probably against nobody teams over Christmas break. No. 30 of those were against number 4 Kentucky at the time, just before Christmas. We held him to 2 points in the first half. And I was just thrilled with Jeremy Fears. I mean, he had him in the torture chamber, really. And I think he ended still with less than double-digit points. And some of those came off of free throws. I just was so impressed with that. And not only did he play well defensively, but I think he had 6 rebounds. I think he had 6 or 7 assists on that game as well. So I think he's someone that when you look at the box score might not immediately jump out to you, but I think just his performance throughout that game, we're losing that game if he's not in there.
Absolutely. And largely because of Jeremy Fears prevented Thornton from ever really getting into any kind of rhythm or place where he was kind of making things happen on a consistent basis. I think a couple of his buckets were some fast break layups. I think 4 of his points were from the free throw line. So I think he really had like one bucket that was really like in the half court offense.
Yes.
And that was huge. Like you said, he was coming off of 2 straight 30-point games, averaging 17.5 on the season. And to be able to really take him out of that game and make him really a non-factor was huge for Michigan State. And that defensive effort on the road is something that does travel.
Yes.
Like you might not be used to be playing on that court or shooting on those rims. Things might not go well with the fans. It might kind of get rowdy, but your defense can travel.
Yeah, that's
and
so
if your defense can be consistent like that to take away opponents' best players, you're going to be in positions to be able to win on the road on a consistent basis.
Definitely. And that just makes me, I know that we've talked about the Tom Izzo mantra of ad nauseum, right? Defend, rebound, run. But I don't think I've seen a team do those things, aside from those maybe few minutes in the second half, as well as this team has, I would venture, since 2020, the 2019-2020 season. Like, I just see these guys have so much hustle. I want to shout out to Jackson Kohler. He had 10 boards on the night. Everybody else did not do the greatest job rebounding. But overall, I think that's something that I've just been really impressed with from this team. And I think that's the huge part, is that mantra starts with defend. You don't get the chance to rebound. You don't get the chance to run if you are not defending well. And I think that's a really interesting factor to think about. Like you said, so many of those other things have factors that you can't control, but you can control your defense even against a player like Bruce Thornton. Man, what a fun win. I'm just
Yeah.
still, it's days later and I am just like pumped up about it. And I am so excited for the Washington game. Before we dive into that and our We Got It Covered segment where we kind of look at how the basketball teams of Oregon, Washington, UCLA, and USC have performed recently before they came into the Big Ten, we want to take it over to halftime. So I'm going to turn it over to you, our analyst, Jonah Wilson, to get us caught up on the rest of Spartan athletics and what's been going on this week.
Yeah, so to start off this week's halftime, we will start with the men's hockey team who had 2 games this week against Wisconsin, their second time playing against the Badgers this year. Thursday night's game was at Munn Ice Arena, where Michigan State fell quickly to a 3-1 deficit.
Yikes.
Kind of midway through the second period. But
that seems like so much to recover from in hockey.
I mean, it is. I mean, you can't really afford to allow any other goals, and you have to be able to, at the very least, get that equalizer, which the Spartans were able to come away with the 4-3 victory against the Badgers on Thursday night, which is just great. They've shown this ability throughout this whole entire season to come back from deficits, and they don't panic. They don't freeze. They just continue to plug away and get those goals needed to come away with the victories.
Absolutely. And Saturday night was a really fun contest at the Frozen Confines where Wrigley Field was turned into an ice hockey arena. And they again took on the Badgers on Saturday there. Very interesting because the Spartans kept a goal lead throughout the game, but still ended with the same score, but in a dramatic fashion. So, like I said, the Spartans were up 1-0, and then 1-1, and then 2-1, and then 2-2, and then 3-2, and then 3-3.
Yeah, Wisconsin had, I think with like 10 seconds left in the third period, ended up scoring that equalizer. Yeah.
Yes. But then in overtime with 1.4 seconds left, the Spartans managed to wiggle in another goal. And when I say wiggle, I mean it, because not only was the goalie in front of the goal, but I think there was an entire another defender behind the goalie in the goal that he managed to slot him past. And really just like such a fun win and such a fun contest at Wrigley Field. It was really interesting watching on television because there was like a few fans that were up close to the glass, but then the rest are in the baseball stadium seating. But even just looking, on social media, people were saying the environment there was just electric and it was such a fun contest, and even more fun when you come away with the victory.
Absolutely.
We're not done with halftime updates, though. Women's basketball is continuing to just demonstrate their strength and their excellent start to the season, pulling away another win on New Year's Day.
They hosted Purdue at the Breslin Center, and they really just had kind of a dominant win against Purdue. I think they ended up winning by like 17. The highlight of that game is Jocelyn Tate, who had a double-double when she had 19 points and 11 rebounds, which again, kind of similar to the men's team. Just a lot of different players for that women's team being able to step up on a nightly basis and get the job done for the Spartans, who, again, this is a talented Big Ten, and with the addition of some of these teams that we're going to talk about later for women's. But Michigan State is continuing to kind of hold pace with some of those teams and continue this hot start they had to the season.
Man, it's so fun to have 2 dominant basketball programs in both the men's and women's teams, and we're just going to keep trusting that that's going to continue. Well, that's it for halftime. We're going to get you headed on over to the We Got It Covered segment next.
As we look ahead to Michigan State's next contest on Thursday night against the Washington Huskies, we thought for this week's We Got It Covered segment, it would be helpful to give a little bit of an inside look on what to expect out of these 4 new teams in the Big Ten in Washington, Oregon, UCLA, and USC, because a lot of times we might be walk into these Big Ten games against maybe a Minnesota or Indiana and at least know partly kind of what to expect or what to typically expect in these Big Ten
with their
opponents.
History.
But with these teams that are new from the West Coast, very different from some of these traditional Big Ten teams, it's hard to kind of know what to expect from them, or maybe what their history is, what their recent history is. So we want to kind of spend a little time this week just showing what do we expect from these teams as they come into the Big Ten.
Yeah, absolutely. Unless you are a, massive college basketball stan and are tuning into every game across conferences, you really probably are only familiar with these teams, if they've made a showing in the NCAA tournament, March Madness. And so I think it is really beneficial for me specifically of I'm familiar with UCLA from football. Oregon obviously made it to the college football playoffs this year. I feel a little bit more familiar with those teams on their football programs, but I feel a little lost when it comes to basketball. And so I'm really curious to see, where do these teams kind of slot in as far as strength goes? And yes, it's still relatively early in the season, but even looking at their recent history from last year to kind of expect how are they going to stack up when it comes to Big Ten play?
Right. So I think to start off, we'll start with UCLA, which honestly is one of the most storied college basketball programs throughout the whole country. As under John Wooden, I think they won 11 national championships.
Wow.
Obviously, that success hasn't really translated as much in our current century, but they're still a very good program out of Los Angeles, coached by Mick Cronin. They made a Final Four during the COVID year of 2021. Mm-hmm. So they've had recent success under their current coach.
And if I'm not mistaken, they knocked the Spartans out on the bubble round of that year.
They did.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about that.
So they are a team that I think will be a positive addition to at least the basketball side of things for the Big Ten, and a team that you're not going to be able to take lightly. They're a well-coached team. They have some different pieces this year, but with their kind of story program, that playing at UCLA is not going to be easy. Yes. They're going to be a disciplined team. They're going to be a team that rebounds and defends well, similar to the Big Ten. I think that's one thing that Mick Cronin kind of brings to UCLA is kind of a similar DNA to a lot of Big Ten teams, and I think they'll transition pretty well into the Big Ten due to that alone.
So let's talk a little bit about that Big Ten DNA when we think about why these teams may have been selected to join. And I know so much of it is the money behind it. But I think when you talk about Big Ten DNA, the first thing that I think of is physicality. I mean, when you come into Big Ten, you know that you are going to be playing all out for 40 minutes of the game. And so I think having depth to be able to support that physicality is huge. What are some other factors that you feel like UCLA fits into in the DNA of the Big Ten?
Yeah, I think to go along with that physicality, just an emphasis on defense. Mm-hmm. Unlike maybe a conference like the SEC where you're having a top 10 matchup like you did on Saturday against Florida and UK, where both those teams are scoring over 100 points.
Yes.
You're just going to have some kind of ugly 63 to 57 kind of grinded out games in the Big Ten. And I think UCLA is equipped to be able to win those kind of games. Whereas in other conferences, you're going to have to be able to score a ton of points. And just I think the slower pace, the physicality, emphasis on defense is something that UCLA fits well into.
That makes total sense. So if we're happy with UCLA, let's turn our attention then to the other California team in USC, who we're also going to face on the road in February.
Yeah, so USC is a little bit different than UCLA. Obviously not quite as storied as UCLA in basketball. Michigan State did face them a couple years ago in the tournament and kind of handled them without too much difficulty. But they actually have a new coach this year, Eric Musselman.
No, not the Arkansas coach.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
So he has taken over the USC job from Arkansas.
Let's just hope he keeps his shirt on this year. That's all I'm saying.
We can all pray, yes. But on the kind of opposite of UCLA, they kind of have that more SEC mentality where they want to put up a lot of points, shoot a lot of threes. Hasn't quite translated this year. I think they're going to struggle a little bit. They haven't really shown a lot this year where I think they can compete for a Big Ten. I don't necessarily think they're going to make the tournament, but I mean, Musselman did have Arkansas in a pretty good place down in the SEC, so I wouldn't be surprised if a year or two from now they're more competitive in the Big Ten. But again, traveling to the West Coast, I think for a lot of these East Coast teams isn't going to be easy no matter who you play. Yeah. So it's not a team you can take lightly. I just think they're more in a transition year where I think their kind of feel and impact in the Big Ten will be felt more in coming years.
That makes sense. And I know the historians out there are going to make a little noise about this, but I agree with your take from football. I think we should get a little Spartan Trojan rivalry going. There might not be too much to it this year. I hope that we can beat them handily again, like we did in the tournament a few years ago. But I just think that'd be a little bit fun. I know the Spartans and the Trojans weren't the exact same era, but it's close enough.
Right.
Let's
it's
have
close
some
enough.
fun
We
with
need a
it.
rivalry for sure.
Absolutely.
Moving on to Oregon, they are a
Ducks.
team who, again, kind of similar to UCLA, have a really good coach in Dana Altman, have made a Final Four in recent years, have honestly been a pretty underrated and steady program under Dana Altman that has kind of flown under the radar, but they're a team that, too, kind of has that Big Ten identity, physical disciplined emphasis on defense, and they've had a pretty successful start to this year, currently ranked number 9 in the country. They've had a stretch where they beat San Diego State, Texas A&M, and Alabama in back-to-back games.
Wow.
It'll be interesting to see kind of how things go as Big Ten play gets going. But they're a team that I like this addition into the Big Ten. I think they're going to be a lot of fun to watch. Going to be a lot of fun to play against. They're going to give us some of those good 10, 11 o'clock games to watch, which are going to be fun, especially when Michigan State is involved and you have to watch those games.
Absolutely.
But I'm excited for Oregon into the Big Ten. I think they'll be, just like in football, a really solid addition where I think even this year they'll be pushing for atop the standings.
Definitely. And we will be facing them at home, which is interesting to think about, as much as it's going to be, I think, a challenge for us to travel to the West Coast. You think about these players are students, they're going to class, they're having to adjust to time schedule. They're trying to have to arrange their classes around being gone for several days because we're facing UCLA and USC in the same trip. But you also have to think about that's also true for these West Coast teams coming to the East Coast, and they're having to travel far more than these East Coast teams are. I mean, the furthest west that you get in the Big Ten before the addition of these teams was Minnesota, right? And so they are making lots of trips to be able to face their rest of the Big Ten opponents. So it'll be interesting to see, will that kind of wear on these teams as the season progresses?
So lastly, thinking of our opponent on Thursday, the Washington Huskies, and when looking at this team, they're probably the team that is coming in with the least amount of kind of history or success when it comes to basketball. Had a pretty rough season last year. It's kind of continuing a little bit this year as well. A team that doesn't necessarily really have a super strong identity or culture like maybe some of these other teams are bringing in. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of culture identity they bring to the Big Ten kind of in this new era for them. But this is really a game on Thursday that Michigan State really should win.
Especially at being at home.
Exactly.
With this, so hearkening back to our last episode, talking about net rankings, quad 1, quad 2, wins, losses, all that sort of thing. Talking about how Washington is not necessarily a top contender. Thinking about a quad win at home, though, where would this matchup potentially place this win or loss?
I'm not exactly sure where Washington sits, but I honestly think this would probably be a quad 3 game for Michigan State. So, yeah, this is not a game that you want to lose and get that first quad 3 loss on your resume.
So really overall for this 2024-2025 basketball season, when we think about the newcomers to the Big Ten Conference, we really got 2 tough teams that are going to be thrown into the mix, and hopefully 2 pretty easy to beat teams when we're talking about just your, strong Big Ten performers. I hope for Michigan State it's going to be 4 wins across the board, but I know that that's going to be a little tough. I think it is a pretty even strength of schedule when you think about just those 4 teams. We're facing one of each of kind of the good and bad teams at home and on the road.
Right.
And so I hope that we can just continue to grow this Big Ten Conference record. I hope we continue to keep a 0 in the right-hand column
Yep.
and just continue to dominate, but we'll see how things shake out on Thursday.
Absolutely, especially kind of considering who's right by our side on the standings. You don't really want to fall beneath those guys, so let's keep those wins rolling.
Definitely. Well, we hope that you feel like you've got it covered when it comes to the Big Ten Conference, new and improved, we hope.
Mm-hmm.
And we would love your feedback, so feel free to send any ideas, thoughts, things that you want to know more about, whether it's football, basketball, any other sport that we can learn alongside with you, over to the We Got It podcast at gmail.com. We're so thankful that you tuned into this week's episode. Go Green.
Go White.
Go State.